Today we will explore one of the greatest medical enigmas that humanity has ever faced, a mysterious disease that decimated Tudor England in a matter of hours, altered the course of European history, and disappeared without leaving traces that modern science could decipher. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. The summer of 1485 brought with it more than the usual heat over England. The battlefield still exhaled the acrid smell of blood spilled in the Wars of the Roses, the long and bloody dynastic conflict that pitted the houses of Lancaster and York against each other for control of the English throne. On August 22nd of that year, on the muddy plain of Bosworth Field in the county of Leicestershire, the army of Henry Tudor defeated the forces of King Richard III, who fell dead on the battlefield. The English crown was changing hands. The victor, who would soon be crowned Henry VII, marched triumphantly toward London with his soldiers and a significant contingent of mercenaries recruited from the European continent. However, amidst the victorious ranks, something invisible and lethal was already moving among the men. Even before the new king could fully savor his conquest, an enemy of an entirely different nature began to manifest, silent and implacable. The first reports were confusing. Soldiers who participated in the Battle of Bosworth suddenly felt unwell, seized by violent chills that seemed to arise from nowhere, followed by perspiration so intense that it soaked clothes and sheets in a few minutes. The malaise progressed with a speed that no doctor of the time could explain. Men who in the morning demonstrated vigor and full health were prostrate by evening, and some did not survive to see the rising of the next sun. There were no spots on the skin like those of the bubonic plague, nor was there a bloody cough like that of tuberculosis. The only evident sign was that abundant and fetid sweat that seemed to sprout from every pore of the body, as if the entire organism were trying to expel some unknown substance, consuming it from within. Henry VII arrived in London on August 28, 1485. Less than 3 weeks later, on September 19th, the disease broke out in the capital with a ferocity that caught everyone off guard. The city was crowded with people who had traveled there to witness the coronation of the new monarch, and this temporary crowding may have contributed to the accelerated spread of the illness. Within a few weeks, the death toll escalated alarmingly. Records from the time indicate that about 15,000 people perished in London during that first outbreak, which lasted until the end of October. Among the dead were 2 mayors of the city, 6 aldermen and 3 sheriffs, men who held prominent positions in the London hierarchy. The disease made no distinction between rich and poor, between the powerful and the humble, although, as would be revealed in subsequent outbreaks, it seemed to have a disconcerting preference for the wealthier classes. The chroniclers of that period recorded the panic that took hold of the population. Richard Grafton, an English printer and chronicler, mentioned the infirmity in his work, describing it as a new kind of disease that hit the entire region with such intensity and cruelty that nothing similar had been reported in the memory of any living person. This description was written by men whose grandparents had witnessed the Black Death, which gives the statement considerable weight. The disease spreading through London was something genuinely unprecedented, something that did not fit into any known category of illness. The doctors of the time, still bound to the concepts of the humoral theory that had dominated medical thought since antiquity, tried to rationalize the phenomenon through explanations involving the imbalance of the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. But none of these explanations could account for the lethal speed with which the disease progressed, nor for its absolutely atypical epidemiological behavior. Superstition and paranoia quickly set in. As was common in that era, many sought supernatural explanations for the calamity. One of the most widespread interpretations was that the disease had been sent by God as punishment for the supporters of Henry VII, a divine retribution for the violent deposition of Richard III. This idea that epidemics represented divine wrath was not new in medieval England and would accompany each of the subsequent outbreaks of the disease. Others pointed to more earthly culprits. The foreign mercenaries who made up part of Henry Tudor's army were said to have brought the infirmity with them from the continent. In fact, there were clues that fueled this theory. The mercenary soldiers Henry had recruited in France were, for the most part, likely of Germanic and Swiss origin, and had gathered in the region of Rouen in northwestern France before crossing the English Channel on August 7, 1485, landing at Milford Haven in Wales. However, records found in the civic archives of York suggest that a pestilence with symptoms similar to the new disease may have affected the city as early as June 1485, even before the arrival of the invading army in England. If confirmed, this evidence would considerably weaken the hypothesis of French importation. Furthermore, the Crowland Chronicle mentions that Thomas Stanley, 1st Earl of Derby, used the sweating sickness as a justification for not joining his troops with those of Richard III before the Battle of Bosworth. If Stanley already knew of the disease on that date, it is possible that it was already present on English soil before Henry Tudor's invasion. The question of origin, therefore, remains shrouded in ambiguity. What was not ambiguous, however, was the terror the disease inspired. The first outbreak receded at the end of October 1485, and for a few years England breathed a sigh of relief. The infirmity seemed to simply evaporate, as if it had never existed. Life returned to its usual rhythm, markets reopened, harvests were resumed, and the new Tudor dynasty consolidated its power. But the calm would be temporary. In 1492, the disease crossed the Irish Sea and reached Ireland, where the Annals of Ulster recorded the death of James Fleming, 7th Baron of Slane, a victim of what they called plaie allee, the sweating plague. The Annals of the Four Masters described an unusual plague in Meath that lasted exactly 24 hours. Those who survived this period recovered. Those who did not resist perished within that precise interval. After this Irish episode, the disease disappeared again from the records for almost a decade. But its return in 1502 would bring consequences that reverberate in world history to this day. In that year, the young Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales and eldest son of Henry VII, was at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh borders, together with his wife, Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. Arthur was seen by his contemporaries as the great hope of the newly established Tudor dynasty. His birth represented the symbolic union of the houses of Lancaster and York, and his name had been chosen in honor of the legendary King Arthur of British mythology. Plans for his marriage to Catherine had begun before his 3rd birthday, part of a diplomatic strategy to forge an Anglo-Spanish alliance against France and Scotland. The young prince was well educated, considered handsome by the Spanish court, with reddish hair and a notable stature for his age. There were no reports that he was a sickly child. In November 1501, Arthur and Catherine were married in a grand ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The couple then departed for Ludlow, where Arthur exercised his administrative duties as Prince of Wales. In the following months, life on the Welsh border passed without major upheavals. Just 9 days before his death, Arthur had performed the traditional Maundy Thursday rituals in Ludlow, showing no sign of illness. However, at some point in March 1502, both the prince and Catherine fell seriously ill. The exact nature of the disease that afflicted them remains a subject of academic debate. Catherine recovered, but Arthur died on April 2, 1502, 6 months before turning 16. Although historian Sean Cunningham, author of a biography of the prince, argues that the most likely cause of death was the sweating sickness, other researchers consider alternative hypotheses, such as tuberculosis, pneumonia, or even a typical cystic fibrosis. When researchers opened Arthur's tomb at Worcester Cathedral in 2002, 500 years after his death, it was not possible to determine the cause of death with certainty. Regardless of the specific cause, Arthur Tudor's death triggered a cascade of events that reshaped the history of England and the Western world. With the passing of the eldest son, the young Henry, then only 10 years old, became the heir to the throne. Queen Elizabeth of York, the prince's mother, quickly became pregnant in an attempt to give her husband another male heir, but both she and the child, a girl named Catherine, died in February 1503. Mourning fell upon the Tudor court. When Henry VII died in April 1509, the young Henry, at age 17, ascended the throne as Henry VIII. One of his first actions as king was to marry his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, the same woman who had survived the disease that possibly took Arthur's life. Henry VIII would reign for nearly 4 decades, a period during which he would marry 6 times, break with the Roman Catholic Church to found the Church of England, and execute 2 of his wives, along with countless courtiers and dissidents. If the sweating sickness or whatever infirmity killed Arthur had not acted in that spring of 1502, the history of England would have followed a radically different path. Arthur would have become king, his marriage to Catherine of Aragon would have remained intact, the break with Rome might never have occurred, and the English Reformation, one of the most transformative events in European religious history, might simply not have existed. While these historical reverberations unfolded over the decades, the sweating sickness maintained its threatening cycle of appearances and disappearances. A second, less severe outbreak occurred in 1507 or 1508, hitting England without spreading significantly beyond its borders. The third outbreak in 1517 was considerably more serious and may have extended to Calais, which at the time was an English territory on the continent. A curious detail recorded during this epidemic was the observation by the Venetian ambassador in London that the disease affected a peculiarly low number of foreigners residing in England. This apparent affinity for the native English population intrigued observers and added another layer of mystery to the infirmity. It was during the third outbreak in 1517 that Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the powerful advisor to Henry VIII, contracted the disease for the first time. Wolsey was, at that moment, one of the most influential figures in England, holding the titles of Cardinal Archbishop of York and Lord Chancellor. His position guaranteed him access to the best medical care available at the time, but none of this would be enough to protect him completely against the sweating sickness. The cardinal survived this first attack, but the experience left marks. When the disease returned with devastating force in 1528, Wolsey was hit again, and reports from the time suggest that he suffered multiple episodes of the infirmity that same summer, recovering each time but becoming progressively more debilitated. Although members of his own household were not as lucky, many of them perishing during the outbreaks, the cardinal demonstrated a resilience that seemed to defy the grim statistics of the disease. The outbreak of 1528 was the fourth and one of the most severe. The first written reference to it dates from June 5, 1528, in a letter from Brian Tuke to Bishop Tunstall of London, in which Tuke reported having fled to Stepney to avoid contagion from a servant in his residence who had contracted the disease. This suggests that the outbreak began in London in late May. From there, the illness spread throughout England, sparing only the far north. Henry V, who lived in constant fear of disease, did not hesitate to dissolve the court and abandon the capital, frequently changing residences in an attempt to escape contagion. The king stayed in isolated locations, purifying the environments with vapors of vinegar and aromatic herbs, refusing audiences and avoiding any contact with people coming from affected areas. The court of Henry VIII was directly hit by the 1528 epidemic. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom the king nurtured an obsessive passion and whose pursuit of a legitimate marriage would lead to the break with Rome, contracted the disease while she was in relative isolation at Hever Castle in Kent. Upon learning of Anne's illness, Henry immediately dispatched William Butts, his second-best physician, as the first was unavailable, to attend to her. Anne survived, but others around her were not so lucky. William Carey, the husband of her sister Mary Boleyn, died of the disease. The love letters Henry sent to Anne during this period reveal the king's anguish at the possibility of losing the woman he desired to make queen. The following year, 1529, tragedy struck Thomas Cromwell personally, who would become one of Henry VIII's most powerful ministers. Cromwell lost his wife and his 2 daughters to the sweating sickness. This devastating personal loss, portrayed centuries later in the acclaimed literary work of Hilary Mantel, illustrates how the infirmity respected no social position, wealth, or political connections. The scene described in historical fiction, in which Cromwell returns home and finds his wife lying with damp sheets, her skin hot and flushed, and by nightfall discovers her dead, with the room perfumed by herbs burned against contagion, captures the daily horror that the sweating sickness imposed on English families of that period. It was also during the 1528 outbreak that the sweating sickness, for the first and only time, significantly crossed English borders and reached the European continent. The infirmity appeared in Hamburg, Germany, apparently brought by a vessel whose crew members were already infected. From there it spread through northern Europe with alarming speed, reaching Bremen, Lübeck and Copenhagen, before advancing east towards Sweden, Lithuania, Poland and Russia. In the Netherlands and Flanders, the disease appeared simultaneously in Antwerp and Amsterdam. However, intriguingly, France and Italy remained practically untouched, except for the English region of Calais. By the end of 1529, the disease had disappeared from the European continent, with the exception of a residual presence in eastern Switzerland that soon dissipated. The clinical descriptions of the sweating sickness, compiled from various contemporary accounts, paint a terrifying picture of an infirmity that attacked with a rapidity that defied medical understanding. Thomas Le Forestier, a French physician working in England, was one of the first to document his personal observations during the 1485 outbreak. In his writings, Forestier described a disease that manifested with intense sweating accompanied by a foul odor, generalized redness of the face and body, incessant thirst, extreme heat and severe headaches. He attributed particular importance to the shortness of breath that afflicted patients in their final hours, suggesting that the disease had a significant pulmonary component. Forestier claimed that noxious vapors congregated around the heart and lungs, a description that, translated into modern medical terminology, would point to some type of acute cardiopulmonary compromise. However, the most detailed and frequently cited clinical account of the sweating sickness was produced decades later by the physician John Caius. Born in 1510, Caius was in Shrewsbury in 1551 when the last great outbreak of the disease hit the region. His work, titled A Boke or Counsel against the disease commonly called the Swate, or sweating sickness, published in 1552, remains to this day the primary historical source of knowledge about this extraordinary infirmity. Caius meticulously documented the stages of the disease, which followed a predictable and terrifying progression. The illness began abruptly with a sense of apprehension, an undefined premonition that something was terribly wrong. Immediately following were intense chills, sometimes extremely violent, accompanied by dizziness, severe headaches, and piercing pains in the neck, shoulders, and limbs. A profound prostration set in quickly. This cold phase lasted between half an hour and 3 hours. Then, without apparent cause, the characteristic sweat broke out suddenly. Beginning the hot phase of the disease, a sensation of intense heat took over the entire body, accompanied by even stronger headaches, delirium, an accelerated pulse, and desperate thirst. Heart palpitations and chest pain were frequent symptoms. Caius observed that no skin rash accompanied the disease, although reports from other observers occasionally mention the presence of small vesicles on the skin. In the final stages, the victim experienced either a generalized collapse from exhaustion or an irresistible urge to sleep. Caius believed that giving in to sleep during this critical phase was fatal, and doctors of the time did their best to keep patients awake, shaking them, speaking to them loudly, and resorting to any available means to prevent them from slipping into unconsciousness. The treatment prescribed at the time was at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive. The chronicler Richard Grafton recorded that common guidance was to lie down immediately at the first sign of symptoms, remain absolutely still during the 24-hour duration of the disease, abstain from any solid food, and severely limit water intake. Doctors, bound by the belief that cold air could be the fatal trigger, ordered the hermetic closing of windows and doors and covered patients with additional layers of heavy blankets. This practice, though motivated by the intention to protect the patient, inadvertently created a suffocating environment that worsened dehydration and overloaded the already weakened cardiovascular system. The rooms were transformed into literal greenhouses, where the patient's body, unable to regulate its temperature, succumbed to the accumulated heat. Reports of doctors who prepared herbal recipes and recommended that patients sweat as much as possible demonstrate how far the medicine of that time was from understanding the basic mechanisms of body thermoregulation. A particularly disturbing aspect of the sweating sickness was the absence of immunity conferred by survival. Unlike most known infectious diseases, in which a previous infection offers some degree of protection against future episodes, the sweating sickness could attack the same person repeatedly. Caius recorded cases of individuals who suffered multiple episodes before finally succumbing. This characteristic eliminated any sense of security that survivors might nurture and kept the entire population in a permanent state of psychological vulnerability. Another element that radically distinguished the sweating sickness from other epidemics of its time was its demographic profile of victims. While most medieval diseases primarily took the poor, the malnourished, and those living in precarious hygienic conditions, the sweating sickness seemed to afflict the wealthier classes of English society with greater intensity. Young men in full physical vigor were specifically vulnerable, as were members of the nobility and the upper bourgeoisie. Historian Elmer Brenner, from the Wellcome Collection in London, observed that this predilection for young males was particularly significant, as in the upper strata of society, these were the future members of the ruling elite. The disease also affected the native English population more severely than foreigners residing in the country, and small children and the elderly were largely spared, another atypical pattern that defied conventional explanations. The epidemics of 1485, 1508, 1517, and 1528 left deep scars on English society. Each outbreak lasted only a few weeks in a specific locality before receding as suddenly as it had appeared. This brevity, while limiting the duration of suffering, intensified the psychological terror, as the speed with which the disease appeared and disappeared made it unpredictable. People had no way to prepare for its arrival and could not relax after its departure, knowing it could return at any time, in any place. In 1551, during the reign of the young Edward VI, son of Henry VIII and his third wife Jane Seymour, the sweating sickness made its last and devastating appearance. The king himself, then only 13 years old, recorded observations about the epidemic in his diary, noting that those who felt the initial chills could die in a few hours, even before reaching the sweating phase, and that those who survived to the second phase entered delirium and died in a state of extreme agitation. This final outbreak demonstrated the same lethal speed as the previous ones, with reports of victims who succumbed in less than 10 hours after the appearance of the first symptoms. Among the most notable victims of the 1551 outbreak were the young Brandon brothers, sons of the late Charles Brandon, 1st Duke of Suffolk, and his fourth wife, Catherine Willoughby. Henry Brandon, 2nd Duke of Suffolk, was 15 years old, and his brother Charles was 14. The two boys were studying at St. John's College, Cambridge, when the disease broke out in the university city. Fearing for her son's fate, their mother, who was staying in Kingston, a village on the outskirts of Cambridge, arranged for the boys to be transferred to the residence of the Bishop of Lincoln in Buckton, in Huntingdonshire, hoping that moving away from the city could protect them from contagion. The precaution was useless. On July 14, 1551, Henry Brandon passed away around noon, a victim of the sweating sickness. His younger brother, Charles, automatically inherited the title of 3rd Duke of Suffolk. But this distinction lasted less than an hour, as Charles also succumbed to the same infirmity that same afternoon. The title of Duke of Suffolk became extinct with his death, and Charles Brandon still holds the record for the shortest period of possession of a peerage title in British history. The boy's mother, who had fallen ill during her son's transfer, arrived in Buckton only to discover that Henry was already dead and Charles was dying. The brothers' private funeral in Buckton was followed in September by a solemn requiem mass featuring banners, coats of arms, helmets, and crowned swords, a tribute to the noble lineage that had been extinguished in a single summer afternoon. The Brandon brothers had carried the orb in Edward VI's coronation procession in 1447 and had been made Knights of the Bath by the young king. They were educated, promising boys, personal friends of the monarch, and their premature death represented not just a family tragedy, but the elimination of an entire aristocratic lineage. This type of event reinforced the perception of the time that no wealth, no title, and no political connection could offer protection against the sweating sickness. After the 1551 outbreak, the disease disappeared. It simply ceased to exist without warning, without explanation, without a gradual decline. Over 66 years, 5 devastating outbreaks had swept England, and on one occasion the European continent, taking thousands of lives and altering the course of dynastic successions. And then silence. No new epidemic was recorded, no isolated case confirmed, no trace of the disease detected in the following centuries. This sudden disappearance constitutes one of the most intriguing aspects of the mystery. In the history of infectious diseases, it is extremely rare for a pathogen capable of causing severe epidemics to simply stop existing without some human intervention explaining its eradication. In the case of the sweating sickness, there was no vaccination campaign, and sanitary conditions in England did not improve sufficiently to justify the disappearance of such a virulent pathogen. A possible historical connection emerged about 150 years later. Between 1718 and 1861, a disease with similar symptoms, though significantly less lethal, was recorded in the Picardy region of northern France. Known as the Picardy sweat, or Sweat de Picard, this infirmity caused approximately 200 localized outbreaks over that period before it too mysteriously disappeared. Welsh physician Llewellyn Roberts observed a great similarity between the two diseases, and researcher Henry Tidy found no substantial reason to doubt that the English sweat and the Picardy sweat were the same condition. Curiously, the region of France where the Picardy sweat emerged is located near Rouen, exactly the place where the mercenaries who served under Henry Tudor had gathered before the 1485 invasion. Was it a geographic coincidence or a clue that the pathogen had remained dormant in that region for more than 2 centuries before resurfacing in an attenuated form? The search for the identity of the causative agent of the sweating sickness has transformed over the centuries into a kind of retroactive forensic investigation in which researchers from different eras and disciplines have tried to fit the fragmentary pieces of an incomplete puzzle. Various hypotheses were raised and discarded over the years. The possibility that it was an extremely virulent form of influenza was considered, but the symptoms do not perfectly fit the clinical picture of influenza, and the sweating sickness did not present the global spread pattern typical of flu pandemics. Typhoid fever was also considered, but its progression is considerably slower than that of the sweating sickness. Typhus, scarlet fever, and even anthrax were suggested as possible causes, but each of these hypotheses presented significant inconsistencies when confronted with the available clinical and epidemiological descriptions. One of the most persuasive proposals emerged in 1997, when researchers suggested that the sweating sickness might have been caused by an unknown species of hantavirus. Hantaviruses are pathogens transmitted mainly by the inhalation of contaminated particles present in the urine, feces, and saliva of infected rodents. Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, identified by modern medicine, presents a clinical picture that bears remarkable similarities to the descriptions of the sweating sickness: sudden high fever, severe respiratory difficulty, and cardiovascular failure. The connection gained additional strength in 1993, when an outbreak of an unknown disease struck the Navajo population in the Four Corners region of the southwestern United States near Gallup, New Mexico. The illness, caused by the sin nombre virus, a hantavirus transmitted by deer mice, presented a clinical progression remarkably similar to that described by Caius and Forestier 4 centuries earlier. Researchers Paul Heyman, Leopoldine Simons, and Crystal Coches from the Queen Astrid Military Hospital in Brussels published a detailed analysis in 2014 in which they argued that both the English sweating sickness and the Picardy sweat may have been caused by hantavirus infections. They highlighted that rodents, natural vectors for hantaviruses, were ubiquitous in Tudor England, infesting residences of all social classes. The great houses of the nobility, with their large stores of grain and food, attracted particularly dense populations of rats and mice. When domestic servants swept up rodent excrement, they could release a cloud of hantavirus-contaminated particles into the air, triggering infection in the household's inhabitants. This hypothesis would explain, at least partially, the disease's predilection for the wealthier classes, who possessed larger residences with more places conducive to rodent infestation. However, the hantavirus hypothesis is not without its problems. Known hantaviruses do not usually transmit efficiently from person to person, while the sweating sickness seemed to spread with a speed that suggested some degree of human-to-human transmission. Furthermore, modern hantaviruses indiscriminately affect people of all ages, while the sweating sickness spared small children and the elderly. These discrepancies led some researchers to propose that, if a hantavirus was indeed involved, it was an extinct species or a variant significantly different from currently known strains. Another hypothesis that attracted academic attention was that the sweating sickness might have been a form of relapsing fever, a bacterial infection transmitted by lice and ticks. This theory had the advantage of explaining the seasonality of the disease, which manifested predominantly during the summer months when arthropod vectors were most active, and its predilection for the upper classes, whose elaborate wool clothing and heavy tapestries provided an ideal environment for the proliferation of lice. Relapsing fever shares several clinical characteristics with the sweating sickness, including sudden onset, chills, high fever, and profuse sweating. However, it rarely kills with the speed described in accounts of the sweating sickness, and its epidemiological pattern differs in significant aspects. A third line of investigation points to the possibility of an enterovirus, a type of virus that replicates in the gastrointestinal tract and can cause pulmonary and cardiac symptoms. Researcher P.R. Hunter of the University of Cambridge proposed this hypothesis in 1991, arguing that an enterovirus would explain both the seasonality of the disease and its ability to spread rapidly in environments with poor sanitary conditions. Enteroviruses are known for their ability to cause explosive outbreaks that cease abruptly, a pattern compatible with the behavior of the sweating sickness. There are also researchers who consider the possibility that environmental factors played an important role. The outbreaks of the sweating sickness coincided with the beginning of a period of climatic cooling in Europe, triggered by volcanic eruptions in Indonesia. These fluctuations could have altered the reproduction patterns of rodents or arthropod vectors, and consequently, the transmission dynamics of the pathogen. Heyman and his colleagues identified reports suggesting that some outbreaks occurred after years in which harvests were damaged by floods, which could have concentrated rodent populations in barns and food stores. The attempt to solve the mystery through modern scientific methods faces considerable obstacles. Viral RNA, which would be the most direct evidence of a hantavirus infection, is particularly unstable and has an extremely low probability of surviving for more than 5 centuries. Although Henry Brandon, 2nd Duke of Suffolk, was buried in a cemetery that still exists, the chances of finding viable genetic material in his remains are considered minimal by experts. Beyond its medical dimensions, the sweating sickness exerted a profound impact on the collective psychology and culture of Renaissance English society. The constant fear of a sudden and unpredictable death fueled a culture of fatalism that permeated the art, literature, and architecture of the period. The acute awareness of the brevity of existence was reflected in the proliferation of the memento mori theme in the visual arts and literature of the time, with paintings of skeletons dancing with the living and tomb sculptures representing decomposing bodies. The lethal speed of the disease and the scale of the outbreaks created unprecedented logistical challenges for affected communities. Families often did not have time to organize proper funerals before other members began to show symptoms. Mass graves were dug in haste, often during the night, to accommodate the growing number of corpses. There are disturbing reports that, given the speed with which the dead needed to be buried, some people in a state of deep coma or extreme lethargy were buried prematurely, a fear that became deeply rooted in the popular imagination of the time. The English economy, dependent on agriculture and the wool trade, suffered severe impacts during each outbreak. Harvests were abandoned in the fields because rural workers were dead or too terrified to leave their homes. Fairs and markets were deserted, and economic activity in hit towns and villages entered paralysis. Trust in traditional institutions also suffered significant erosion. The Church, which was expected to be a source of spiritual comfort and theological explanation for the world's ills, could not offer satisfactory answers for the existence of a disease that indiscriminately killed the righteous and the sinner, the rich and the poor, the devout and the indifferent. Doctors, who were supposed to be the line of defense against illness, proved powerless before an evil that did not respond to any known treatment. From bloodletting and purges to herbal potions and protective amulets, This double failure of religious and medical authority opened space for the questioning of established certainties and contributed, albeit indirectly, to the intellectual climate that would favor the Protestant Reformation and the birth of modern science. The shadow cast by the sweating sickness over the political life of Tudor England was equally significant. The disease's ability to strike the highest nobility transformed every outbreak into a potential succession crisis. The premature death of Arthur Tudor is the most eloquent example of this dynamic, but it was not the only one. Henry VIII, who lived in permanent fear of the disease throughout his reign, took drastic isolation measures every time rumors of a new outbreak reached the court. Thomas More, one of the king's closest advisors, wrote that it was safer to be on a battlefield than in a city during an outbreak of the sweating sickness. This statement, coming from a man who knew well the dangers of both war and disease, illustrates the dimension of terror that the infirmity inspired. When we look at the sweating sickness with the medical knowledge of the present, what is most impressive is not just its virulence or its lethal speed, but the persistence of its mystery. In an era where science is capable of sequencing entire genomes in a matter of hours, identifying new pathogens with state-of-the-art technologies, and tracking the spread of epidemics in real time through satellites and computer algorithms, the identity of the disease that terrified Tudor England for 66 years remains unknown. We do not know for sure what it was, where it came from, how it was transmitted, why it preferentially affected certain demographic groups, or why it disappeared. For experts in biosecurity and virology, this mystery is not merely a historical curiosity. It constitutes a reminder that nature possesses a repertoire of pathogens that we still do not fully understand. Contemporary climate changes, which alter animal species habitats and the distribution patterns of disease vectors, could create favorable conditions for the emergence of new pathogens or the awakening of old ones. And random mutations in the genetic material of viruses and bacteria occur constantly, producing variants whose behavior is, by definition, unpredictable. The contemporary world is immensely more connected than 15th century England. A disease that in the time of Henry VII took weeks to spread could, today, cross continents in a matter of hours, carried by airplane passengers and goods circulating through global supply chains. Humanity's recent experience with pandemics has demonstrated both the advances and the limitations of our collective preparation. The ability to quickly sequence genomes, develop diagnostic tests, and produce vaccines in record time represents an extraordinary leap compared to the medicine of Caius and Forestier. But the speed of disease dissemination in a globalized world and the difficulty of coordinating effective international responses reveal vulnerabilities that are not so different in essence from those English society faced 5 centuries ago. The sweating sickness remains an open chapter in the history of medicine. Its mystery continues to attract researchers who try, with the resources of genomics and paleobiology, to extract answers from deteriorated bone fragments and centuries-old manuscripts. Each technological advance brings with it the hope that the pathogen's identity will finally be revealed. But until that day comes, the mystery remains intact, a testament to nature's ability to produce phenomena that defy our understanding. The thousands of people who perished between 1485 and 1551, drenched in sweat and consumed by a fever that no one could explain, were human beings with full lives, with effective relationships and plans for the future. Their deaths, recorded in chronicles and parish records that survived the centuries, are testaments to lives interrupted by an enigma that science has yet to decipher. The history of the sweating sickness invites us to reflect on the fragility of the human condition and the importance of the permanent search for scientific knowledge. It shows us that apparently solid civilizations can be shaken by an organism invisible to the naked eye. It reminds us that nature operates according to its own rules, indifferent to human ambitions. The English sweat may have disappeared from medical records almost 5 centuries ago, but the questions it left continue to echo in research laboratories and public health centers around the world. The next great biological threat could emerge from anywhere. The question is not if new diseases will arise, but when and if we will be sufficiently prepared to face them. The history of the sweating sickness teaches us that the price of complacency can be measured in human lives. and that knowledge is the solidest defense we possess against the dangers we cannot yet see. If this narrative awakened your curiosity and made you reflect on the mysteries that history and science still hold, consider yourself part of this investigation. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow each new dive we take into the most intriguing chapters of the human past. Leave your comment, telling us what caught your attention most in this story. Share your opinion on which theory might explain the disappearance of the sweating sickness, and help us keep this conversation alive. Like this video so that more people can discover this enigma that has remained unsolved for over 500 years. History does not tell itself. It needs someone willing to hear it, question it, and pass it on.